What's going on, y'all? So, should you remove all of the breaths from a vocal? Let's find out using Wave's DeBreath. So, this is Wave's DeBreath. This is a plugin that allows you to remove or attenuate breaths. And I asked the question in the intro of this video, should you remove all of the breaths from a vocal? Because I was recently doing a mix for an artist, and when I sent them my mix, they replied, I thought you were going to remove all of my breaths. So let's take a look at what happens when you do that, as well as how to use Wave's DeBreath. So I've got a vocal here from Coretta King, and I'll play it without DeBreath, so you can hear that we do have some breaths in here, and some of them are pretty loud.
Of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is this love that I'm feeling? Yeah. Is this love? Is this love? Is this love that I'm feeling?
Okay, and this is with DeBreath, and this is removing the breaths.
Of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is this love that I'm feeling? Yeah. Is this love? Is this love? Is this love that I'm feeling?
So when you remove the breaths, it just doesn't sound natural. So I'll show you a little later how I would treat this with DeBreath. But first, let's get into the controls of DeBreath, and then we'll do some more with it. So DeBreath is very easy to use. You see, we only have a few controls, but let's go over them. Looking at the left, well, let's start with this way. This plugin is broken up into two paths. You have the breath and the energy, which is the gate. So this works similar to, or very similar to a gate. So if you're familiar with a gate is going to open to let sound in and then close when there's no sound playing, depending on the threshold that you set. The way DeBreath works is when it detects a breath, it's going to close that gate, and once the breath is over, it opens the gate, letting the sound back in. So the top is the breath section, below is the energy, and the sliders on the left is your threshold. So for the breath threshold, the higher that you set this, the less breaths it's going to detect. So this is with it all the way up. And I will say that just the starting position, just the default, is a really good setting that they have here to get started. But just to show you, this is what happens when you move the breath threshold all the way up.
Of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is this?
So you can hear we're getting breaths there. And if you set this too low, it's going to detect likely more than the breaths.
Of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is this?
So now it's attenuating and removing parts of the vocal, not the breath. So where we had it just by default set in the middle worked fine, but you may need to adjust this for your use, but you shouldn't have to go to the extremes of the 100 or 0. Same with the energy gate on the bottom half as well. You shouldn't have to go to the extremes of 0 and the negative 64 there. On the right, this is the gain reduction meter here. And then this slider is how much you're going to attenuate. Right now it's set to infinite, which is going to remove it completely. And then the more we slide this up, the less reduction we're doing. So all the way at the top is at 0. We're not doing any reduction. So you can go anywhere from 0 to infinity there. Fade out and fade in. So when the removing or attenuation of breaths happen, This is how you're going to set how quickly that's going to fade in and fade out here. And this has a range from 5 milliseconds up to 200 milliseconds. And then monitor. So you can listen to the voice or the breath path. So this is the voice. We're not hearing the breaths, just the voice.
Of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is
And if you want to hear just the breaths, you can select the breath path. So that's good to, detect and just make sure that you're removing or attenuating really just the breaths and nothing else. And finally, room tone. So this is going to add some white noise when it removes the breath, so there's not just a gap of silence. And I'll solo the vocal for this, but this is without the room tone. We'll put it for the breath path for this. And this is now with the room tone on. Okay, so let's get into now just setting this for this vocal. So to first thing I'll say is where it goes in the chain. I like to put this first in my signal chain and not last. Compression does turn up breaths a little bit. So that's why I like to put it first. And just to look at the vocal chain I have going on for this vocal, I've got deep breath first, then sibilance, then V comp, and then the Puig tick to add some air on top. And also, before we get into just tweaking deep breath for this vocal, I want to point out the way that deep breath works, it has to look ahead to determine the breath. So this does add latency quite a bit. If we look at the performance, we can see, yeah, we're at 734 milliseconds of latency. So it does add a significant amount of latency in order for it to work. So, with that being said, if you have this open in a track that or a session that you're doing like production in, you're going to want to bypass this if you're, playing some keys or playing some drums, because that latency will affect you in the session. Okay, so or at least in my opinion, removing breaths completely doesn't sound natural. Your brain just wants to hear the breath there. So, what I told the artist is that it's not going to sound natural if I remove them, but I can turn them down. And that's what I'm going to do here. So these starting points, I'm going to leave the same. I am going to let's adjust the fade out and fade ins, go to about maybe 20 milliseconds. And the reduction, let's start with, let's do maybe 32 and hear what that sounds like, and we'll go from there.
of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is this love that I
Okay, so that's still attenuating a little too much for me. Let's put that in half to 16.
of a single bed. Ooh, is this love? Ooh, is this love that I'm feeling? Yeah. Is this love? Is this love? Is this love that I'm feeling?
Okay, so I like that a lot better. So we've turned down the breaths and it still sounds natural. So normally I handle breaths by doing it manually and just chopping just the breath and turning just that down with the gain envelope. But sometimes you may get that vocal that's just has intensive breaths in it, or even think if you had a bunch of background vocals, you just too much to do by hand, and that's where something like deep breath can really come in handy. I've got a link in the description if you want to check this out or learn more about it. Waves generally always has this on sale. I can't remember if I mentioned it, but I picked this up for free during the sale last year. It was buy two get two free, or buy two get one free. So glad that I did, because this is one of those Waves plugins that I just really don't see many people talk about, but is very useful. So what do you use for handling breaths? Do you do it manually? Do you have another plugin that you use? Let me know. Any questions, comments, let me know, and I'll catch y'all next time. I want to invite you to check out my podcast, the Faders Up Podcast, where we discuss pro audio and beyond. We discuss everything from recording to gear to the music business. So if you're an audio engineer, songwriter, recording artist, music producer, this podcast is for you. We recently started season 2, and we're going to have a lot of listener questions on this season, as well as some really cool guests that's lined up, and giveaways as well. So if you've already subscribed and followed the podcast, thank you. If you haven't, it's available on all platforms, and I encourage you to check it out. Also, rate it and review it, and let us know what you think.